The United States and officials from Iran met directly for direct talks on Saturday to discuss nuclear ambitions and a potential path toward peace. The White House describes the meeting as positive and constructive and a critical first step to a mutually beneficial outcome. Well, what could such an outcome look like? Can peace be achieved between the United States and Iran? Here to discuss this is Ilan Berman. He is a senior vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council. He is an expert on the regional security in the Middle East, previously consulting for the CIA and the Departments of State and Department of Defense. Ilan, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, good to be back.
So I just want to immediately kind of get your thoughts on Saturday's meeting, how the conversations went. What do we know?
So I think the jury's still out. All of the public messaging has been that it was a constructive early step, but it was an early step. The parties are ostensibly meeting again this coming weekend in Rome, Italy. But already you're beginning to see at least a little bit of tension creep into the conversation because the pace on the negotiations, as we talked about before, the Iranians have a very vested interest in having negotiations last longer. The White House really wants them to be short and to the point. And the question is, how many cycles of this can we go through before there's really an understanding that the Trump administration means business?
That was kind of what I picked up from President Trump's comments earlier today, that he's not for dragging this thing out. He wants action and he wants it quickly, because I think he may know when someone's trying to play him.
No, listen, I think that's absolutely right. And that's the reason why the president when he sent the initial letter offering negotiations to the Iranians, he set a 2-month time frame. That clock is now ticking, right? It's been ticking since this weekend. And it's very clear that the White House wants action for a couple of reasons, right? Which we discussed before, because the room for maneuver for the international community to restore sanctions is expiring, because every week that we wait, Iran marches a little bit closer to the nuclear weapons threshold. And so for all of these reasons, the White House really wants some sort of definitive answer. And soon, and for exactly the same reasons, the Iranians want not to give a definitive answer soon.
Ilan, prior to Saturday's meeting, you posted a comment on X. You said that the Trump administration won't just be negotiating with the Islamic Republic in this instance. What did you mean by that? Who else is involved in this?
Well, what's interesting is that we are, I think, laser focused on the negotiations between Washington and Tehran. But the Iranians are trying to play this on many different levels. And so simultaneous with negotiations with the president's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, the Iranians have also sent emissaries to Moscow and Beijing to negotiate a common trilateral stance on the nuclear program. And I think that's really one to watch, because that's going to be the Iranian play. Iran is going to nudge Moscow and Beijing into trying to play a larger and larger role in the negotiations, trying to broker some sort of multilateral agreement. And by default, because both Russia and China are strategic partners of the Islamic Republic, this is going to be an agreement where it's 3 against 1.
Could that kind of backfire, though, given in the same setting today, the president asked questions about the Russian missile attack on Ukraine over the weekend, clearly irritated by this because he's not been able to accomplish what he said he was going to do, and that is get a ceasefire there. I mean, let me ask you this question. Is he operating with a short fuse in terms of patience, given what he's already been up against?
I think so, and I think increasingly so. And by the way, the Ukrainian strategy of agreeing to this 30-day ceasefire, I think, has a lot of merit, because from the Ukrainian side, I think what they're trying to do for the Trump administration is to demonstrate that Russia is not negotiating in good faith. Russia continues to carry out acts of aggression, like we saw over this past weekend. But here, the adversary also gets a vote, and so what I think what you could possibly see is the Russians have already said that they want to play a role in brokering some sort of peace, some sort of agreement between Washington and Tehran. The more the Russians are given a chance to do that, the more salience they have and the more patience they get from the White House. So the Russians are not a disinterested party here. If they help out with the Iranians, I think they get a longer leash when it comes to Ukraine.
So back with Iran, the regime there and their proxies, are they holding them on a short leash right now?
Well, no. And in fact, one of the really interesting poison pills that the Iranians have already tried to slide into the negotiations is they've made very clear that they're willing to negotiate like they did last time over their nuclear program, but they're not willing to negotiate over other things like the activities of their proxies, including Yemen's Houthi rebels, which are really carrying out a very sophisticated Iran-empowered strategy to hold maritime commerce in the Red Sea hostage. This is, I think, an Iranian play to preserve the integrity of their proxies. It's also a bargain, frankly, that Washington shouldn't take.
Because if we don't address all of it now, we're right back at the table, because we've seen what the Houthis, for instance, have done to the shipping, international shipping. We see at what Hamas has done in the Middle East. So these are all a part of the same problem.
No, I think that's exactly right. And if we shrink down, if we define Iran's deviancy down to just their nuclear program, we set ourselves up for strategic surprise, because Iran has made very clear over the last 3 years that it's not moving around the region in a predictable fashion. It's using proxies, it's using cutouts, but it's doing things that are fundamentally changing the security environment in the Middle East, and not in our favor and not in the favor of our allies like Israel. And so addressing just one aspect of Iran's rogue behavior is a recipe for more rogue behavior to come.
Is the United States approaching this from a standpoint of trying to exhaust every legitimate means to resolve the nuclear threat that Iran poses to not just the United States, but really to the world, knowing that it's highly unlikely that this fanatical regime is going to agree to disassemble and let the world see that?
I think so. And I think certainly the White House has to at least make some effort to exhaust all options. But I'm not sure that there are many delusions in the White House about the Iranians actually coming to the table and meaningfully dismantling their nuclear program. The other fast mover in this conversation is the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because Israel views Iran, especially a nuclear-armed Iran, as an existential threat to Israeli security. And so this is very much the pace. This is the the player that sets the pace for these negotiations. I think it's clear that if the negotiations drag on, if the negotiations don't yield something of substance, the Israelis are going to get impatient, and the Israelis may move independently militarily. And that's one of the reasons why the president issued his warning to the Iranians.
I mean, this is high stakes negotiations, because as you've pointed out, as we talked last week, and we've heard this actually for a few years now, that they're at the threshold, but apparently it's been confirmed that they are at the threshold of being able to take this enriched uranium. And I think still in question is the delivery systems, that's not yet been perfected, but we're close. And so they can't just keep dragging this out. At some point, it's fish or cut bait.
No, that's exactly right. And actually on the delivery systems, the ballistic missiles, the Iranians have actually made pretty significant progress. That it's that third prong, the weaponization, the conversion of the enriched uranium into warheads, putting it on a missile, that they're still working on. But every intelligence estimate that I've seen, in the unclassified domain, suggests that that's going to happen as early as this summer and as late as next summer. So we are looking at a window of opportunity of 18 months before the Iranians have a usable nuclear weapon, or perhaps many. And so the clock is very, very clearly ticking on this one.
If I'm not mistaken, I think ballistic missiles were also a part of the discussions this weekend.
So I think it remains to be seen. And this is, I think, a really important point, because in the JCPOA, in the 2015 nuclear deal that Iran hammered out with the P5+1 countries, ballistic missiles were taken out of the scope of work. And that was seen by the Trump administration when it decided, the first time it was in office, when it decided to abrogate the deal as a fatal flaw. So it's going to be really one of the make or break moments in these negotiations that the Trump administration is having now with the Iranians. Trump is going to want ballistic missiles to stay in. And for the very same reason, the Iranians are going to want to take them out of the negotiations.
Well, and they've been able to advance the ballistic missiles during this time period.
No, absolutely. And in fact, the what is staring down the road at us is that this fall, the final provisions of the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, fall away. And so there's already a more liberal environment for conventional weapons commerce with the Islamic Republic. And after October, the gate gets blown wide open. And so there's a worry that Iran will, after October, after this fall, when there's not a threat of the rapid reimposition of multilateral sanctions, Iran is going to sprint to improve the sophistication of its ballistic missiles in ways that are going to be very, very dangerous to the Western community.
Now, is there any evidence that they've been able to utilize their proxies, or in particular Russia, in enhancing some of their technology? Because I know, like for instance with us, our relationship with Israel, I mean, Israel's constantly utilizing military equipment. We're getting the benefit of that, and we're upping our game as a result of the intelligence and the actual practical application of that materiel. Are the Iranians doing the same thing?
So yes, and they have been for some time. The Russians have provided very significant inputs into their nuclear program, advisedly their civilian nuclear program, nuclear reactors and such. And the Chinese have been helping, as has the North Koreans, in improving the sophistication of their ballistic missiles. And that is having actually a trickle-down effect. In terms of Iran's ballistic missile sophistication, that translates into the sophistication of weapons that are wielded by Iranian proxies like Hezbollah. In fact, when Israel moved against Hezbollah in October, one of their principal targets was eliminating these large stockpiles of Iranian-provided missiles because those missiles were seen as a danger to the security of the Jewish state. And so it's very clear that what comes to Iran doesn't stay in Iran.
Well, that goes back to your earlier point. As the United States is engaged in these discussions with Russia regarding Ukraine, there are other factors out there that need to come into that conversation. One, I mean, we really need to lean on Putin. I mean, Putin, I don't trust the guy. But we need to, if we're going to talk with him and have negotiations with him, we've got to lean on him regarding Iran to try to isolate them.
No, I think that's right, but we should do it advisedly and frankly, skeptically. For 2 decades, we've been operating under the premise that if we create the proper conditions, we can really separate the Iranians and the Russians and sort of flip the Russians so that they're more cooperative. And by the way, these days, we're having that same conversation with regard to Russia and China. But if you look at the Iranian-Russian relationship, Russia is, because of its war in Ukraine, is now actually increasingly dependent on Iranian assistance, Iranian drones and Iranian hardware and battlefield materiel, in a way that, frankly, it's going to be very hard to pry Moscow away from Tehran because Moscow needs the Iranians.
Wow, it's a very complicated mix when you look out across the globe and what I would say, I mean, it's been there for a while, but I think it's gotten worse under the neglect of the previous administration. And Donald Trump has a real mess on his hands to try to figure this out.
No, absolutely. And as the president's made clear, the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking because of how fast Iran is moving towards a nuclear capability, and also because disorder breeds disorder elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so the longer there's hostility in the Middle East and there's conflict in Europe, the more it's likely to spread. So time is of the essence.
Ilan, I want to thank you for joining us again today. I really appreciate your insight, and it's an issue of great concern. So thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.